Hi, I'm Dr. Frank Varney. I teach at St. Michael's College in Vermont, and I am gratified to be asked to discuss with you folks my new book, General Grant and the Verdict of History, Memoir, Memory, and the Civil War. Winston Churchill said once, "History will be kind to me, for I intend to write it." But it could easily have been a lot of people, including, and I believe, Ulysses S. Grant. People who write memoirs obviously intend for themselves to be the hero of their memoir. That is human nature. The problem is when we forget that memoirs are not historical documents. Essentially, what they are is one person's memory, one person's perspective on events. And individuals can be swayed by matters of egotism, desire to make themselves look good, or even just plain human error. This is Major General Ulysses S. Grant. There have been people who thought that in my two books, this one and the previous one, General Grant and the Rewriting of History, that I set out to attack this man. That's actually not at all the case. Before I began my research, I was sort of a Grant fan. I admired the man, and to a degree, I still do. I just think we have awarded his memoirs far more impact on the history of the Civil War than we should have, to the detriment of the truth in some cases. Okay, for an example, since I'm assuming that not everyone who's watching this has read my first book, I'm going to do very lightly a few of the high points from that book. The Battle of Shiloh. I don't think there's any doubt that Ulysses S. Grant was caught napping. His army was not entrenched, which he had been ordered to do by Henry Halleck. He was not actively patrolling, and Grant himself was 8 miles away, not in telegraphic communication with his army, when the Confederate attack came. In fact, only the day before, he had reported to Halleck via telegram, "I do not anticipate an attack on this army." Well, that's interesting because he stoutly denied that he was ever surprised. He went to his grave denying that, but obviously he was. Otherwise, why wasn't he with the army? Why wasn't the army entrenched? Why wasn't the army patrolling? Why weren't they prepared to resist an attack? Why weren't they consolidated? He had troops several miles away upriver. When he was waiting for Don Carlos Buell's army to join him, and Buell arrived the day before at where Grant was, at Savannah, Tennessee, and said something about he'd move his army down, and Grant said, "No, wait and do it in the morning. There's no rush." Well, in the morning, the Confederate attack came. So again, you can see a pattern of deceit starting here. This gentleman was the focus of much of Book One, General William S. Rosecrans. He and Grant had known each other at the academy. They served together amicably for a time, and then all of a sudden that all fell apart. And this is basically when it happened. This is a modern map. Obviously, the interstate system wasn't there today. It would have made things much simpler for the armies had it been. But you can see where the Battle of Shiloh took place towards the top of the screen. The purpose of the Shiloh campaign was to capture Corinth. Now, after Shiloh, Grant was relieved of his army command by Henry Halleck. He was sort of shunted into a sideshow as second in command of the army, but he had no real responsibilities. Halleck took Corinth and a rather ponderous campaign, and then Halleck was called east to assume command of the Union war effort. And Grant was left in charge. Confederates moved on the city of Iuka down towards the southeastern part of the screen, and they had captured that, and Grant was forced to find a way to get rid of them. His plan was that he would head more or less due east along what's currently the highway there, and with the command of Edward Ord, and they would launch an attack. Rosecrans, with his command, would go southeast towards the town of Jacinto, and then up and approach Iuka from the south, closing the only two good roads out of the town, and that he would fall in the Confederate rear once the battle had started. Unfortunately, it all fell apart. Part of it was because Grant got about 8 or 10 miles from Iuka and stopped. He just waited. Rosecrans discovered as he was moving up from the south that the two roads he were to cover were uncomfortably far apart and separated by bad terrain. He was outnumbered by Sterling Price's army. If Grant had divided his force to cover both roads and Price realize what was going on, he could have concentrated enough men to defeat either or both of Rosecrans's column in detail. So Rosecrans, and he told Grant he was doing this, he sent a message. He was going to stay on the Jacinto Road till he got farther north. There was a road there, you can see in the map, the Bay Springs Road that connected the two. At that point, he intended to swing part of his force over, and then he could cover both roads. The problem with that is that was dependent on Grant and Ord launching their attack, and they never did. So Rosecrans, with a smaller force, was forced to try to fight his way through Price's command. Ultimately, he did, but he was unable to cover the other road, and Price's army escaped. Grant's first report of the battle, he praised Rosecrans. However, in a later report, and we'll come to in a few moments to the reason for that, he was highly critical. And in his memoirs, he was very critical. Battle of Corinth. Between the battles of Iuka and Corinth, a letter arrived at Grant's headquarters, which we're going to discuss in a moment. But after the victory at Iuka, Grant pulled back to Jackson, Tennessee. He separated his command. Rosecrans, with the largest element of it, held Corinth. And the Confederates attacked. Rosecrans was outnumbered. In fact, Rosecrans is the only Union Army commander who was consistently outnumbered. In the 5 major battles he fought, he was outnumbered in 4 of them, and in the 5th, he had roughly equivalent force to the Confederates. That was unusual for Union Army commanders. They generally had the disparity of numbers on their side. As you can see from the map, Confederates pushed Rosecrans' forces backwards into a heavily fortified series of redoubts that Rosecrans had constructed. And he held on there. And then Earl Van Dorn, who was in command of the Confederate forces, abruptly withdrew. Rosecrans wasn't sure if they were withdrawing or if they were simply pulling back before launching another attack. That had happened the previous day. And he did eventually start chasing them. And he was a little bit late doing that, but he did get troops underway. And Grant sent him reinforcements who arrived the day that the pursuit began. The Confederate forces did escape. It wasn't really due to lack of energy on the part of Rosecrans. He certainly contributed to it, his late start. What really happened was Grant sent Ord and Hurlbut to block the crossings of the Hatchie River, and they stopped the Confederate attack. But then, instead of waiting for Rosecrans to close on the Confederate rear, Ord attacked across the river, got his command pinned down under the heights there, and that allowed Van Dorn to sideslip and cross up another point, and the Confederates escaped. Grant blamed Rosecrans for this. Okay, this is the author of the letter that I mentioned, that between the battles of Iuka and Corinth, his letter arrived at Grant's headquarters. The question I usually ask when I'm doing this presentation for a live audience is, would you buy a used car from this man? He doesn't look, to me at least, terribly trustworthy, but that could be because I know something about him. His name is Colonel Mortimer Leggett. And he wrote a letter to John Rawlins, Grant's chief of staff. And he claimed that Rosecrans was responsible for some newspaper articles that were appearing in Ohio newspapers, that Grant had been drunk in command at Iuka. He claimed that Rosecrans, or someone at his headquarters, was the person responsible for those reports. He offered no proof. He wasn't at Iuka. He wasn't at Corinth. He wasn't with Grant. He wasn't with Rosecrans. He was with a detached command. So he really had no way of knowing what the truth in that I can tell, but that was the claim he made. Now, I don't know for sure that caused the rift between Rosecrans and Grant, but I do know that the day after he sent that letter is when Grant submitted his second report of the Battle of Iuka, in which he was highly critical of Rosecrans. And some of the things he accused him of were things that had been mentioned in Leggett's letter, particularly taking on heirs that were above his station, that were taking credit for actions that should have been gone to Grant. Well, that brings us to a question. What went wrong at Iuka? Grant did not follow through with his part of the plan. He claimed in his memoirs that he was at his headquarters at the depot in Burnsville, where he was coordinating the movements of the columns of his army. But there is a 40-hour gap in which not a single order goes from, or communique for that matter, goes from Grant's headquarters to Rosecrans's over Grant's signature. There is one message sent signed by one of Grant's staff officers. That officer and another staff officer then mounted their horses and rode 23 miles to Rosecrans' column to ask him what was supposed to happen next. They had just come from Grant's headquarters. You would think they would know what Grant's plan was. Which brings me to the conclusion that perhaps Grant was indeed drunk. Now, it's sort of an accepted truism among Civil War historians that while Grant did fall off the wagon from time to time, it never affected his performance in battle. I think it may have done so here. I can't see any other explanation for this 40-hour gap in communications and for these staff officers who came from Grant's headquarters not knowing what was supposed to happen. And when Rosecrans gave them his interpretation of his orders, if it was at odds with what Grant's plan was, you would expect they would have fired off a message to Grant telling him that, but no such message exists. So Colonel Mortimer Leggett may have been more important in the history of the Civil War than we have thought. I believe he may have been at least partly responsible for what turned out to be a dangerous rift between two capable and talented Union Army commanders, Ulysses S. Grant and William S. Rosecrans. Okay, Battle of Stones River. Rosecrans was detached from Grant's command, sent to take command of Don Carlos Buell's army, which he renamed the Army of the Cumberland, and he fought the Battle of Stones River. At the time, it was considered an important victory. Rosecrans was given the thanks of both houses of Congress and of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln sent a telegram telling him at a time when we really needed a victory, you delivered one. And yet today, it doesn't really get that kind of credit. Excuse me. One of the reasons I suspect is because late in the war, when Grant was overall commander, he was in Washington, he was in a cabinet meeting, and Lincoln referred to a dream he'd had the night before. And he said, whenever I've had this dream, the next day I received word of a victory. And he proceeded to list several victories, and among them was Stones River. And Grant interrupted the President of the United States to say Stones River was not a victory. Lincoln said, on that we shall have to disagree. Well, what's interesting is that today Rosecrans' role is really, really ignored. If you read books on Stones River, it often appears as though it sort of just happened. You know, it's either minimized as a bloody draw, except that, I guess you could look at it that way, but the Confederate Army was advancing on Nashville. He defeated them. He inflicted more casualties than he took on an army that was slightly larger than his, more gross casualties and more casualties on a per capita basis, if you will. And the Confederate Army under Braxton Bragg abandoned the field. So he held the field. That's usually another sign of victory at that time. And Bragg actually retreated beyond the point he had launched his campaign from. I'm not quite sure what else Rosecrans needs to have done in order for this to be called a victory. Today, his role, I said, nearly ignored. When a few years back, I was doing a book signing at Stones River National Battlefield Park. And during a break, I walked through the museum again and looked at it. It was a new one at the time when I was doing my research there. They were in a temporary setup. And, you know, these plaques they have on the wall, and they talked about the run up to the battle, and Rosecrans is prominently mentioned. Then they came to the battle. And for the entire period of the battle in this museum, Rosecrans' name did not appear once. And then after the battle, he's back again. But again, even there in a battlefield commemorating his victory, he was ignored. Now, I mentioned this on C-SPAN a few years ago, and they did, I don't know if it had to do with me or some other people made a comment to it, they might have simply realized it. But his name is now on some of those plaques, at least. I think he could still get more credit than he does. But again, he's sort of the battle. It's almost like the victory, if it was a victory at all, was won without Rosecrans' contribution to it. That's not what his men said. One of them said years later, I can see him today as if he were a god of battle. General Palmer, who didn't really like Rosecrans, he served under him here, and he served under him later in the war. He didn't like Rosecrans much, but he said, if I were fighting a battle for control of the universe, I would give General Rosecrans control over as many men as he could see and as many as could see him. He was an inspirational leader, apparently. Okay, the Tullahoma campaign. Rosecrans had trouble getting his army organized, but mostly he had trouble getting it supplied. He had cavalry who didn't have horses. He had men who didn't have weapons. He didn't have enough food to launch a campaign in tough terrain, which the Tullahoma campaign was. He's constantly criticized He was at the time by, excuse me, Edwin M. Stanton, and he is later now by historians, largely because Grant criticized him in his memoirs for taking too long to launch the campaign. Well, here's my question. So what? Ultimately, the campaign was a victory. And even if he did delay, and there is really no strong evidence that he did, it had no detrimental effect on Union fortunes. It did not affect Grant's siege of Vicksburg, which was going on around the same time. Nothing bad happened. And yet Rosecrans' campaign is studied in some military academies around the world. It is a masterpiece of organization and maneuver. It's right there to be seen in the OR, the orders, the detail which was carried out. And yet he's criticized for taking too long to do it. Modern studies by military men have said that they found nothing wrong with his supposed delay, that he was simply getting his army ready for a major campaign. I mean, when Grant took command of armies at various times, he didn't generally immediately launch them into a headlong attack. He got them prepared, and then he launched his attack. Okay, nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong when Rosecrans did it either. Also, Tullahoma is largely ignored because it happened at the end of June in 1863. And of course, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, Battle of Gettysburg, July 4th, Grant took Vicksburg. Since Tullahoma was not a whole lot of fighting, it was mostly about campaign of maneuver, and he outmaneuvered the Confederates. It doesn't get a whole lot of attention. Rosecrans himself said later, it will probably not get a lot of notice because it was not written in letters of blood. Chickamauga is often considered a catastrophic defeat for Rosecrans. Well, first of all, let's look at the reasons. He was outnumbered. Due to the lack of movement by Burnside, who was in Knoxville, and Grant, who was in Vicksburg, they were both ordered to move to his support, and neither of them did. Again, the first book goes into a lot more detail. I'm going to move through this quickly. It was a tactical defeat, but it did accomplish the objective, which was the capture of Chattanooga. And it wasn't nearly the route it's often depicted as. There's plenty of eyewitness accounts that the Union troops who withdrew, for the most part, one division broke. The rest of them made an orderly withdrawal back to Chattanooga. Rosecrans was then betrayed by his chief of staff, James Garfield. Garfield was elected to Congress at this time. When he left Chattanooga, he was pulled aside by George H. Thomas, who was Rosecrans' senior corps commander, and he was Garfield was asked by Thomas to please put an end, when you get to Washington, to these terrible damned lies about Rosecrans. Garfield said he would, but he was intercepted on the way to Washington by Edwin M. Stanton and Andrew Johnson, who essentially said to him, when you get to Washington, here's what you're going to tell the president if you want our support for your political career. And Garfield did that. He basically reported that Rosecrans just sort of collapsed on the battlefield. There are several accounts that are routinely cited by historians when they talk about Chickamauga, and they talk about the supposed panic of Rosecrans. None of them are credible. And I'm not going to go into the detail here because that's not what this book is about, but it is in the first book. I urge people who are interested to take a look at it. Then Grant was appointed to command, and he relieved Rosecrans for what turns out to be no valid reason. The Army of the Cumberland was not starving and had not lost faith in its commander. And Rosecrans was taking active steps to alleviate the situation in Chattanooga. Lincoln then assigned Rosecrans to Missouri over the objection of Grant, just in time for him to have to deal with Sterling Price's Missouri raid. While that was going on, Grant stripped Rosecrans of most of his effective troops. Now, this was not part of some dark plot. Something else was happening at the same time. John Bell Hood had turned aside, and I realized he couldn't stop Sherman's march to the sea, so he turned aside and headed north and was heading for Nashville. And Grant was trying to find troops anywhere he could to reinforce Thomas, who held Nashville. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. Sterling Price's raid caused problems in Missouri, but the invaders were finally defeated, and Rosecrans was removed by Grant for taking too long to do it. Okay, which brings us to the first general who comes in for a major portion of discussion in the book, General Joseph Hooker, Fighting Joe Hooker, as he's known. Okay. He was defeated at Chancellorsville, and there's no doubt that it was a defeat. But when you really look into what went wrong there, it wasn't as much his fault as I used to think it was until I started doing some detailed research. In fact, to me, what is very telling is that the Joint Congressional Committee on the Conduct of the War, who conducted an investigation of the Battle of Chancellorsville, found that there were several reasons for the defeat that they believed. Almost none of them were really anything remotely Hooker's fault. I won't go into a lot of detail here because I don't want to take too much time, and it is in the book. Hooker was defeated, but it wasn't as much his fault as we've been led to believe. And he certainly never uttered the line, "I just lost faith in Joe Hooker." Stephen Sears has done a pretty good job of proving that wasn't the case. It's in the book on controversies in the Army of the Potomac. And the article that he wrote is called "In Defense of Fighting Joe." Okay, which brings us to the next stage of Hooker's career. When Rosecrans was besieged in Chattanooga, troops were dispatched from the Army of the Potomac to reinforce him, 2 corps under the command of Hooker. And by the time they arrived, Rosecrans had been relieved by Grant. So Grant launched a plan to break out of Chattanooga. Hooker's part of it was to take Lookout Mountain. That wouldn't be an easy chore. I've visited Lookout Mountain on several occasions. I'll be back there in November for the anniversary of the battle. I'll be at the visitor center there, speaking and signing books. And I'll tell you the truth, I wouldn't want to hike up that thing, let alone with somebody shooting at me. But Hooker and his troops took Lookout Mountain in much heavier fighting than Grant would later acknowledge. Grant would say that the Battle Above the Clouds, which this came to be known as, was a romance. It was all a fantasy. There was no battle above the clouds. That's not what the men who fought there, or the men even who witnessed it from the plane, said. There was a very significant battle there, which I address in the book. Okay, this is Grant's plan. As you can see towards the bottom of the screen, Hooker is to take Lookout Mountain and threaten the Confederate left. George H. Thomas and the Army of the Cumberland were to hold their position opposite Missionary Ridge, the main Confederate line, and that would enable, according to the plan, Sherman to attack the Confederate right and roll it up. Unfortunately, it didn't work as it was planned. Sherman could not get on to Missionary Ridge. His attack was thwarted by Pat Cleburne. But 2 other things enabled Grant to win the battle. One of them was that Hooker, having taken Lookout Mountain, then bridged the ravine and started along Missionary Ridge to the Confederate left. At the same time, Grant ordered Thomas's men forward to the foot of Missionary Ridge to seize Confederate rifle pits there. The intent was for them to stop, according to the orders as remembered by every officer involved in this, including even Philip Sheridan, who was later one of the Grant men. They moved forward, they took the position, they found they were coming under heavy fire from the ridge, and they simply kept going. The men of the Army of the Cumberland charged up Missionary Ridge without any orders. According to witnesses on Orchard Knob, where Grant's headquarters was, at the time, Grant was furious. He demanded to know who had ordered those men up the ridge. And the implication was heads were going to roll. But they took the position. They basically drove Braxton Bragg and his army off the ridge. And Grant, not at all shy later about taking credit for it. He once said that of all the battles he fought, not a single one conformed to his plan as well as this one did. He later claimed that he had ordered Sherman's attack so that it would Bragg would have to send reinforcements to Sherman, and that would enable the attack on the center to break the ridge, capture the ridge. But again, there's no indication that that's true. A study by James H. Wilson, who was a Union officer there and later one of the Grant men, although eventually he would have a feud with Grant, he did a study of the Confederate reports and said no Confederate troops were moved off there. And he also said that was not the plan. It was Sherman who was to make the deciding attack. But Grant chose to remember it differently. Grant chose to take credit for it. Again, it's not that he doesn't deserve any credit. One of Grant's great strengths was flexibility, being able to adapt to changing circumstances on a battlefield. The problem is when he then insisted that any failure, even in a victorious battle, was the fault of a subordinate. That's where I have issues with him. This is roughly Grant's position on Orchard Knob, and that's Missionary Ridge. As you can see, at a not inconsiderable height. At the time, the area was much less heavily forested than it is today, so it would have been everything would have been much more visible. Okay. Grant then is called east to take command of the Union war effort. He leaves Sherman in command in the west, using Chattanooga, remember, captured by Rosecrans, as the jumping off point. He drives on Atlanta. What's interesting is that 2 of the significant commanders in this attack, this campaign, were Joe Hooker and George H. Thomas, and they performed well. The problem is, towards the end of the campaign, Hooker resigned his command. He did it because he was enormously offended. One of the things that had gone wrong at Chancellorsville was the failure of Oliver Otis Howard to follow orders. He had gotten orders from Hooker at the end of the first day fighting there to prepare to receive an attack, to refuse his right flank, to entrench if it was possible. Hooker even offered to send reinforcements an artillery battery, which Howard refused. The problem was Hooker knew, and he told Howard this, that there were orders that there were reports, of heavy Confederate forces moving towards Howard's right, but Howard ignored the orders. And when he was attacked, his command collapsed, which really led to Hooker's defeat at Chancellorsville. So what does that affect the Atlanta campaign? Because as they're nearing the closing portions of the campaign, one of the Army commanders in Sherman's command is killed, James McPherson. And instead of appointing Hooker to the command, which would have been the logical thing, he was the senior officer in rank, seniority, and age, and he had been a former Army commander. Oliver Otis Howard was promoted past him to the command, the man whom Hooker believed was most responsible for his defeat at Chancellorsville. So Hooker angrily resigned his command. As far as Thomas's impact on this, he and Hooker both performed very well. The problem is, after the war is over, Grant will begin complaining about Thomas and that he's too slow, and we'll go into more of that in a moment. But all I can say is Thomas performed very well in this campaign, as did Joe Hooker. Sherman gets all the credit, and Sherman was the overall commander, so he deserves credit. But there should have been more to go around, I think. This is George H. Thomas, really widely beloved and respected by his men, by his subordinates, by the Civil War public today, the people who read the Civil War, and by all of his superiors, with two exceptions, William Tecumseh Sherman and Ulysses S. Grant. And I think even Sherman's displeasure is sort of retroactive because he knew that Grant was trying to belittle Thomas's reputation. When Sherman launched his campaign from Atlanta to the sea to take Savannah, he left Thomas behind in what was expected to be a backwater theater. The troops that he left Thomas with were, in Sherman's own words, the unfit and the useless. They were the walking wounded. They were men who had disciplinary charges against them. They were dismounted cavalry. They were men who were disarmed, lost damage to their weapons. Wasn't expecting anything was going to happen there. Thomas was supposed to be sidelined, apparently, by Grant and Sherman, so Sherman could get the credit for this campaign. John Bell Hood, as I mentioned earlier, launched his surprise invasion of Tennessee, which caught Grant and Sherman completely by surprise. Hood was defeated at the Battle of Franklin, which is southeast of Nashville, by forces under the overall command of Thomas, although Thomas was not present on the battlefield. He then withdrew those troops to Nashville. Hood marched north and sort of laid a loose siege to Nashville. He didn't attack. He couldn't really surround the city. Hood seems to have been kind of waiting to see what was going to happen next. Grant began firing telegrams to Thomas, ordering him to attack immediately. Thomas's response was that he did not have sufficient troops who were fit to attack at this point. He had cavalry with no horses, and he's facing Nathan Bedford Forrest, among others. He has troops with no weapons. He has artillery with no ammunition. He doesn't have pontoon bridges or engineers. That he's doing the best he can. He will attack as soon as he can. Grant sends a secret message to Schofield, who is in part of Thomas's command, and he orders Schofield to be ready to assume command if Grant tells him to. Thomas responds to this hectic series of messages, almost panicky in their tone. He tells Grant, I'm trying to attack, I'm going to attack. We've had a very severe ice storm. And in fact, men and horses, he'd had incurred casualties as these men and horses fell, just trying to take position. Grant then changed his mind about Schofield, and he sent Blackjack Logan by train to take command, orders to take command if Thomas had not attacked by the time Logan arrived. And then Grant finally got on the train himself and headed out. But before Logan arrived, Thomas had attacked, and he defeated Hood's army, and it was really as lopsided a defeat as the Civil War offers us. He did not destroy Hood's army. It's a very rare thing in history for one army to completely destroy another. The Battle of Cannae and places like Little Bighorn are the closest we can come. Even Little Bighorn, there were survivors. But Thomas did win the battle, and he won it handily. And once again, as with Rosecrans, we have to ask, what harm did his delay do? Hood accomplished nothing. No harm was done. Sherman did not have to detail troops to go back to Tennessee. The only real harm done was to Rosecrans in Missouri, because Grant detached some of his troops to send to Thomas. And Thomas had attacked before those troops arrived, and Rosecrans ultimately won the campaign in Tennessee anyway, in Missouri anyway, excuse me. So I don't see any real harm that was done by Thomas's supposed delay. So why would Grant feel the need to harp on it? And yet he does. In his memoirs, he includes all of his telegrams to Thomas to reinforce the idea that Thomas was being dilatory, that he was ignoring orders. Was he slow? Well, that's the memory of him we have, but it only comes from Grant and then retroactively from Sherman. Thomas also served under Rosecrans and Buell, and they didn't complain about it. They both viewed him their most effective corps commander. During the Atlanta campaign, his men were always where they were supposed to be when they were supposed to be there. And that's ultimately, basically, the way Thomas's performance can be evaluated throughout the entire war. He's really one of the most effective Union commanders. And yet we have this image of him as slow, which really comes almost exclusively from Grant. Why? Well, there was no to impugn his courage or his ability, so Grant damned him with faint praise, as he did a number of people, like Meade in his memoirs. And too many historians have simply taken Grant at his word. As you can see in the footnotes in my books, I cite things from other historians, and you look often at, they credit Grant with things or denigrate other generals. And when you look at their footnotes are very frequently Grant or another historian who's used Grant. It's rather alarming when you really realize it. One historian who wrote a book called The Generalship of Ulysses S. Grant, I mean, he's analyzing Grant's generalship. Almost his only source is Grant's memoirs. That is not going to give you a balanced view of Ulysses S. Grant's abilities. And yet, that's what's happened. So this is part of the problem we see. Grant's memoirs have been accorded far too much weight in the evaluation of the history of the Civil War. Brings us to our last victim, Gouverneur Kemble Warren. He served very well with the Army of the Potomac from the beginning of war till almost the end. And then at his moment of crowning victory, he was relieved from his command after a victory by General Philip H. Sheridan. That's been blamed on Sheridan's temper. That's not true. It happened at the behest of Ulysses S. Grant. So how did he get in trouble with Grant? This guy inadvertently contributed to it, Ambrose Burnside. Not one of the shining lights of the war, although William Marvel did an interesting job in the book he wrote about him, saying that some of the faults attached to Burnside are simply not accurate. Well, what did Burnside do wrong? Well, he messed up at the Battle of the Crater, but he had help. Those of you who've studied the Crater know that, the plan was they dug a tunnel under the Confederate lines at Petersburg, where there was a stalemate, blast a gap in the lines, and troops would then pour through and break up the Confederate defenses. The problem is at the 11th hour, Grant discovered that the unit Burnside intended to use was a black unit, and he ordered them to choose other troops. Burnside didn't handle it very well. The orders to make the attack went to his probably least effective division commander, Ledlie, and the men were not aware what they were supposed to do. The explosion happened. The men charged. They charged down into the crater and were trapped there and were butchered. There was, of course, a court of inquiry. In fact, there were two, an Army court of inquiry and a congressional court of inquiry. And General Warren, whose corps was adjacent to Burnside's, gave testimony. And during his testimony, he was asked what went wrong. And he said, the fault was that I'm paraphrasing, but that there needed to be someone present with the authority to give orders to all three units involved. Meade, who was present at the inquiry, said, "Are you talking about me?" Warren didn't say yes or no. He simply repeated what he said. Someone who would give orders to all three units involved. Well, the three units involved were one from the Army of the Potomac, one from the Army of the James, and Burnside's command, which was sort of semi-independent. He was attached to the Army of the Potomac by an administrative artifice because he was senior in rank to Meade. The only person with the authority to give orders to three different armies, besides the president, and Lincoln wasn't there, would have been Ulysses S. Grant. Grant didn't forget this. Now, it's possible, I suppose, that Warren didn't mean Grant, and yet who else could he have meant? Also, he wrote a letter to his wife that evening or the next night, I recall, in which he said, "I have run up against General Grant. You must be prepared to see me disgraced." So it's pretty obvious to me that Warren knew what he had said was going to get him in trouble. But his crime, if you will, was under oath, giving testimony and saying what he, answering the questions put to him as honestly as he could. This is General Philip H. Sheridan. He will actually be the person who relieves Warren of his command. He is Grant's weapon. And here's what happens. It's March 31st, 1865. Sheridan finds the Confederate right he's been probing for, and he sees an opportunity. And he sends a message to Grant asking for infantry support. He names the unit he wants. Grant says, "It's not available. I will send Warren," who is the closest. His Fifth Corps is the closest command. Warren has been in contact with the enemy that day. He has to disengage, and he has to make a southwest and then north march again through very bad roads in very heavy rain. There's been a couple of days of heavy rain. The roads are a quagmire. The streams are all swollen. He completes the march. He links up with Sheridan, and the next day, April 1st, they launch an attack and win the Battle of Five Forks. And after the battle, Warren sends messenger to Sheridan asking for orders, and he is told he is relieved of command. He is to report to General Grant. Warren writes to Sheridan and asks him to reconsider. He's told, "Reconsider hell, obey my orders." Warren is never reinstated. The war ends, and this man who has served his country ably and well is not present, at least surrendered up Appomattox. Okay, this is the actual Battle of Five Forks. When Warren's troops arrive after a very difficult overnight march, they are arrayed for battle as Sheridan orders them to be arrayed. Sheridan tells Warren that the Confederate troops are directly in front of him, but as you can see from the map, they aren't. It's heavily wooded terrain, so Sheridan's mistake is not hard to understand. But when Warren's divisions start forward, they find there is no one there. They have to make a swing left in the process of their advance, and they hit the Confederate left and roll it up and help Sheridan win the battle. Okay. Warren was relieved of command. Meade actually appealed to Grant and suggested he reinstate Warren. Warren should have had his day in court within 30 days by Army regulations at the time. It took him 18 years to get it. Grant was General-in-Chief of the Army, and he kept denying the request. Then Grant was interim Secretary of War briefly. Then he was president for 2 terms, and he simply overrode every request of Warren's. And then when Grant was no longer president, Sherman was General-in-Chief. And Sherman denied it. And everybody knew the next General-in-Chief was very likely to be Sheridan, who obviously was not going to grant Warren his day in court either. Inquiry finally came about by direct order of President Rutherford B. Hayes, who a Union general himself, and apparently not a big fan of Grant. He believed that justice had not been done here and that Warren deserved a court of inquiry, either to affirm that he was promptly and justly relieved, or to say that he was relieved fairly. There were 81 days of testimony. It was dragged out for 18 months. It took place on Governor's Island in New York Harbor. The charges: that he'd been slow in his night march, had failed to reach his position by the appointed hour of midnight. There are no messages to Warren telling him to be there by midnight. None. There are none really to anyone. Meade has no idea what's going on. He's not told that Warren's to be there by midnight, and he is part of Meade's command. He was charged of having reached the vicinity of Five Forks. He was slow putting his troops into action. Well, what's interesting is when he arrived there, Sheridan expressed surprise at seeing him. He wasn't in it. Sheridan didn't seem aggravated. He didn't ask him where he was, considering he was supposedly been there hours earlier, according to Grant. He was troops were told to stand down and have breakfast, that Sheridan would send for him when he was ready. And that's what happened. He was charged he did not follow Sheridan's orders for the attack. Well, as you've seen, those orders were incorrect. But there are eyewitnesses who said, from both Warren's staff and Sheridan's staff, who said that Sheridan dictated the orders, Warren wrote them down and showed them to Sheridan, who approved them. He then disposed his troops for the attack, and Sheridan reviewed the disposition and approved that. So it's hard to see what orders he did not follow if Sheridan approved the orders he gave. was charged he didn't exercise adequate control over his troops during the attack. Well, they did wander off into the woods, but he went after them and redirected them. And the fact that they were going in the wrong direction was actually Sheridan's, not Warren's. Then he permitted one of his divisions to break and did not exert himself to inspire the men. One of his divisions did break briefly. That was not uncommon in Civil War. Sheridan was asked during the court of inquiry if he never had one of his units break, and he admitted that he had. But as long as they rallied, it was generally considered acceptable. Warren rallied the men and led them into the final attack himself on horseback at the front of his men with his corps colors in hand. His horse was shot from under him, and when a captain stepped in front of him to help him up, the captain was shot. You know, Sheridan's charge that General Warren wasn't part of the attack could not have possibly been more unfair. But the main thing here that's interesting, he was charged with ignoring a direct order by Grant. That really requires a lot of attention. These are the relative positions of them when all of this started. This is Gravelly Run. Okay, supposedly Warren was supposed to be there by midnight, according to Grant's order. As I said, there's no indication he ever got such an order, but he had to cross this. Now, I took this photograph in a very dry summer, and you can see it would be difficult to wade across, particularly with cannon and wagons and so forth. Picture this, however, in pitch darkness, after 3 days of heavy rain, when by Sheridan's own engineer's testimony, the roads were, quote, a hopeless quagmire. The bridge had been destroyed over Gravelly Run. In order to cross it, Warren's men had to tear down a house and a barn and build a bridge in pitch darkness, but they did. These are the kind of roads Warren had to take. This is the area there today. This is a side road, but at the time, this is pretty much what all of them look like. And again, picture these as such thick mud that one officer said that the horse's hooves sank down, or legs sank down up to the fetlock, that it was hard getting him out. So it's hard to see how Warren's men could have moved a whole lot faster. That he was still putting his troops into action. Well, his troops were ordered to stand down until called. Sheridan showed no concern about the delay. And when they were finally put into motion, according to the testimony of several of Sheridan's officers, their movement was delayed due to reconnaissance by Sheridan's own cavalry, who blocked the road. That he didn't follow Sheridan's orders. Sheridan claimed Warren issued incorrect orders that were at odds with what he wanted. He said under oath, he destroyed my plan. But multiple witnesses saw Warren copy Sheridan's map, and that Sheridan approved the orders Warren wrote. That he didn't exercise adequate control. He went off into the woods, found his men, and redirected them. That one of his divisions broke. Eyewitness testified the troops retreated but rallied and attacked with Warren ahead. One of the people who was dead by the time of the court of inquiry was George Armstrong Custer, but he had been under Sheridan's command, and in a letter to Warren, he said that he saw Warren leading his troops into the final attack. Sheridan's testimony included the following exchange. Hugh is Warren's attorney, Albert Stickney. As far as I understand, you had no knowledge at the time of what General Warren did do in this battle after you parted with him at the beginning of the attack. Sheridan said, no, I had no knowledge. Nor did you make any inquiry to find out what he'd done. I didn't have time. You never asked him? No, I did not. And yet he relieved him of command on the tenuous proposition that he had not followed orders. He admitted under oath he had no idea what Warren had actually done. Here's Warren's final assault. As you can see, in conjunction with Sheridan's attack, it pretty much just destroys the Confederate position. Aerial view of the area today. This is the Five Forks right at the center there. Now they're paved, of course, but there's still not much there. Okay, I'm not going to go through this now, but I put together a timeline to find out what happened with this supposed order that Grant sent, ordering Warren to be with Sheridan by midnight. Okay, here's Sheridan's testimony about that message from Grant. Can you recollect whose handwriting it was? No, sir. Can you recollect what you did with the original? No, sir. When did you last see the original? I don't know. Have you any reason to believe the original is in existence anywhere? No, sir. Did you turn it over to the War Department? I don't know. This is a document that supposedly is the basis for Warren's removal of command. I suggest no such document ever existed. No one testified to it, the existence of it, except Grant, who said he sent it, and Sheridan, who said he received it. No other officer at their headquarters testified to the existence of this order, and it is not physically in existence today. It's not in the OR. Sorry. Question asked of Grant. Why did you send the message to Sheridan that Warren was on the way before you sent the message to me telling him to send Warren? That seems a logical question. Here's Grant's response. Could not possibly be more vague. I think there was a little delay of half an hour caused in that way before sending the message to General Warren. I think there was a little delay on sending General Warren his orders in consequence of that. I think that I did, as I've stated, but I will not be sure about that. I think there was a delay of that sort in sending General Warren his orders, which I did not know of at the time I wrote to General Sheridan. I think there was a delay long enough for General Meade to come to my headquarters to see me in person. Yes, I couldn't state it positively, but I have an indistinct recollection that there was a delay in that way. Again, could he be really much more vague? And of course, Meade is dead by this time, so he can't be called to testify whether he rode over to see Grant to question. And why would Meade question the order anyway? Meade had suggested previously, in a message we have, suggested to Grant that he send Warren to assist Sheridan. Why would he then require clarification that would require him to ride to Grant's headquarters? Warren Court of Inquiry. Grant volunteered to take the stand. He testified Warren disobeyed a direct order from Grant. Warren was acquitted of all charges. This is a courageous act. Consider that the men sitting on this court of inquiry are all active duty officers who are under the command of Sheridan, or Sherman rather, will be under the command of Sheridan. Indications are the order from Grant never existed. The findings are withheld until after Warren's death. He never knew his reputation had been restored, and he was buried with no military honors. Among his final words were, "I die a disgraced soldier." And his wife was ordered to vacate base housing forthwith. Sheridan claimed a particular officer had carried the message. That officer testified, Forsyth. He said he did not carry the message. He wasn't even at Sheridan's headquarters that night. They suggested another officer. Michael Sheridan, Phil Sheridan's brother. He said he did not carry the message. All he carried from Grant's headquarters to Warren's headquarters was a verbal message that help was on the way. He said at the time I left General Grant's headquarters, there was no indication as to what corps would be sent. They suggested another officer then, but he was conveniently dead and couldn't be called to testify. So as I say, there is no one to validate Grant and Sheridan's claim that that message was sent. Okay. As is the case probably with every history book ever written, when it's finished, you find things that you wish you'd had in the book. These are a couple things that came up after book one was completed. A witness at Shiloh claimed that Grant did not give a single order at Shiloh that moved a division, a brigade, or a regiment that day. In fact, there's very little testimony to where he was. He arrived at Pittsburgh Landing, rode to what became known as the Hornet's Nest, where Benjamin Prentiss was making his stand, ordered Prentiss to hold the position at all hazards, and rode away. We don't see him again until Don Carlos Buell arrives with the lead elements of his column. And he, according to Buell, he finds Grant on a riverboat, a gunboat in the middle of the river. And yet Grant takes credit for, the survival of his army at Shiloh. Okay. The Battle of Belmont, Grant's first independent action. He told the story of what happened there at least 11 times, according to an officer who served under Grant and admired him. And the story was different each time Grant told it. The first time he told it, it was, according to this officer, Colonel Conger, it was very nearly a defeat. The second time, it was a drawn battle. It got better and better in every telling, until finally, it was a notable victory. Grant was not akin to adjusting the truth to suit his needs. And if this officer is telling us the truth, one of the most well-remembered aspects of Belmont is mentioned by no other witness. Supposed to be, the stories I'd always read about Belmont was that Grant was the last man to board the transports when his army retreated, and that he rode his horse. He was supposed to be a master horseman, rode his horse up a single plank onto the steamer. According to this man who was there, nobody saw that. There should have been hundreds of accounts of this. The only person who testifies to it, however, is Grant. And I am now finished. I will take questions when the time comes. And for anyone who wishes to contact me. Okay.